Hello, welcome, and thank you for watching another webinar hosted by The Forge. Today's webinar will focus on a discussion on South Africa's welfare system, and in particular, we'll look at the social grant system, its merits and its limitations. And we're quite delighted and feel honored that we have two incredible and important guests to be part of this conversation. And they are Neil Coleman and Professor Shireen Hassan. Welcome to you both, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Good to be here.
For inviting us.
Thank you. So for a bit of context, I'm going to read a quote which I think is most relevant for this conversation today. And after that, I'll introduce our speakers by reading their bios, and then we'll proceed with the conversation. So according to the Institute for Economic Justice, fact sheet number 18, 2019, Post-Apartheid South Africa provides a striking case study of the intersection between economic inequality, social exclusion, and human rights deprivation. And despite the more inclusive agenda initiated in 1994, which included the adoption of some of the strongest constitutional projections for economic and social rights in the world, enjoyment of these rights remains elusive for the majority of people. Systematic inequality continues to be ingrained in the country's economic and social structures, resulting in the world's highest levels of income and wealth inequality. Poverty and unemployment are experienced by a large percentage of society and intersect with disparities in access to quality healthcare, education, housing, and even food, close quote. And this unfortunate reality presents the conditions of chronic precarity that characterize the majority of the South African population, in particular, the poor and the working class. These conditions of chronic precarity related to inequality, poverty, and unemployment have been worsened by the COVID-19 pandemic. And for many poor South Africans, social grants are the only source of income and sustenance. Today, we discuss the South African welfare system with a focus on the merits and limitations of the social grants system. And to help us do that, as I said earlier, I'll be in conversation with Neil Coleman and Professor Shireen Hassan. Neil Coleman is co-director of the Institute for Economic Justice, IEJ, a progressive economic policy think tank that was launched in September 2018 by a group of South African academics, activists, and former government policymakers. The IEJ's core objective is to provide policymakers and progressive social forces in South Africa with access to rigorous economic analysis and well thought through policy options to address the multiple socioeconomic challenges confronting the country. Neil worked for the Congress of South African Trade Unions, COSATU, from 1989 to September 2017. From 1995 to 2007, he represented COSATU in the constitution-making process and in Parliament. He was involved in policy development work over much of this period, having co-directed a team which drafted over 250 submissions on policy and legislation to Parliament and government departments between 1995 and 2007. And from 2008 to 2017, continued to work on various policy and strategy issues in his position as strategies coordinator of COSATU, of the COSATU Secretariat, From May to December 2009, COSATU seconded Neil as special advisor to Ibrahim Patel, the Minister of Economic Development. Neil represented COSATU in numerous fora, participating as COSATU delegate in various social dialogue and national political structures, and the National Economic Development and Labour Council, NEDLAC. He represented COSATU in several international fora, such as the International Labour Conference and the International Council of the World Social Forum. His most recent role in COSATU involved giving strategic policy advice to COSATU, as well as coordinating various teams of experts for the Federation, including working with the country's top progressive economists. From 2015 to 2017, he led the labor delegation, the three federations in NADLEC, in negotiating South Africa's first national minimum wage. This was implemented in January 2019. Thank you, Neil, again, and welcome.
Thanks very much.
Professor Shireen Hassan is Canada 150 Research Chair in Gender and African Studies at Carleton University, Ottawa. She's also visiting professor at Weiser University of Witwatersrand, Johannesburg. She has written and edited several books, including No Shortcuts to Power, Women and Policymaking in Africa, and Go Home or Die Here, Violence, Xenophobia, and the Politics of Difference in South Africa. Women's organizations and democracy contesting authority won the Victoria Shark Award for Best Book in Women in Politics from the American Political Science Association. Her most recent book was an archival recuperation of work of the South African sociologist Fatima Mia. She is a member of the Academy of Science of South Africa. Thank you so much, Shireen, and welcome.
Thank you.
So as a way to start the conversation, I thought to ask the question, so when we're referring to a social welfare system, what exactly are we referring to? And what purpose is it supposed to serve? And I'll start with you, Shireen.
Sure. Okay. So this is, I'll try not to do this as if I were lecturing, but forgive me if it comes across like that. So social welfare systems, there are many types in the world. There are many different types of social welfare systems. I'm only going to talk about the kind of social welfare system that I think South Africa was trying to emulate in the mid-1990s. And that is what you would call a redistributive social democratic system of welfare. The best examples of which come from Scandinavian countries, right? And really those welfare systems were crafted as a kind of compromise, a kind of a way to, if one could put it like this, to stave off revolution, right? To meet the demands of the working class, the kinds of demands that the market was not meeting for the most part. So people, there are periods in time when people are unemployed. There are needs that people have that are not met by the wage. And the state took on the meeting those needs because wages never fully compensated people for the work that they did. So in the first instance, these welfare systems were tied to formal labor. So when you got unemployed, you paid in, often contributory, you paid in, and then when you were unemployed, you got an unemployment insurance, right? Or if you're disabled or you hurt yourself on the job. And then onto that core idea of work, and I think the work idea is really important for us to bear in mind, because capitalism's changed fundamentally since these welfare systems were designed, right? So we're added onto that, and often through the intervention of feminists, a number of other kinds of supports were added to welfare systems all around the world, and to different degrees, some better than others. But these were supports that you might think of as dealing not with market failures, but with family failures. So what about single mothers, right, who are not getting support elsewhere? Where are they meant to get it? So in sum, you can think of the welfare system as a way of us as the people, the public, through the state, agreeing on what it is we will minimally or maximally support for people who need it. I mean, that's the heart of the conversation. What is the kind of society we are prepared to fund through public funds? I mean, does that help? I mean, that, like, I could go on and on, but in broad, right, that's what it is. And societies tend to answer that question differently. So the more redistributive social democratic forms think of a broad role for the state or the public in what we will support. And then the more kind of lean and mean states like the United States have very slender welfare systems because they see a very small role for the state. I think coming into the post-apartheid period in South Africa, most of us assume the state would play a large redistributive role to reduce all the economies that, all the inequalities that come mainly out of the economy, but some of us were also saying the inequalities that come out of the social distribution of work.
Thanks so much, Shireen. That's actually very rich. Neil, I'm sure you have views on this.
Yes, I mean, just to add to what Shireen was saying, you know, in 1994, we inherited a racialized social security system. So just as you had, you know, more or less full employment for whites, you know, welfare state for whites, various types of benefits, et cetera, we inherited, you know, the unemployment benefit system, we inherited the child support grant, the old age pension. And so what the government did was to deracialize that system. But it was based on the idea, on the notion that the needs that people had in relation, particularly to the employed, were cyclical. It was only when the economy, you know, contracted, went into recession, or when it boomed, that people were either employed or lost their jobs. And that was a completely inappropriate understanding of the South African reality, because, of course, for decades, we've had what's called structural unemployment for the majority, where, number one, they were marginalized, dumped in Bantustans and marginalized urban ghettos, and therefore had to rely on their own communities for support, the extended families, etc., to eke out a living. And didn't have the benefits that, in essence, the white working class and the privileged white elite had. So the fundamental flaw in the ANC government's approach to deracializing the system was not to appreciate or not to be prepared to grapple with the reality that there was this huge grouping of people, unemployed adults in particular, who had very little access to social security and social benefits. And that has underpinned all the debates about the about the need for comprehensive unemployment insurance, et cetera. Actually, I mean, you mentioned our role in Parliament. One of the first engagements we had in Parliament was around the white paper on social welfare. And we pushed very hard against the white paper because the white paper didn't provide for comprehensive social security. And we managed to get, as COSATU, a provision put into the white paper which provided that the government would work towards comprehensive social security. And that then led to the discussions in the Taylor Committee of Inquiry in the early 2000s, which looked at extending the social security system to the unemployed adults, but either through a basic income grant or through other mechanisms. But that was never taken forward, largely because of very conservative fiscal and macroeconomic policies, which was not prepared to allocate the resources that would be required for such a comprehensive social security system. The other thing is that, as Shireen has said, you know, you have either with social security, you either have transfers, income transfers from the state or you have contributory schemes. So like the unemployment insurance scheme is a scheme where only the employed benefit from the UIF because they contribute together with employers, and when they become unemployed, they draw benefits, and that's for a limited period of time. But those who are structurally unemployed, long-term unemployed, who've never contributed to the scheme, don't get any benefits. So at any point in time, we calculated about 7% of the unemployed are entitled to benefit from the unemployment insurance fund, and therefore the state's overall role as providing a income protection floor has not been realized in South Africa. The big gains that were made, one were to equalize to equalize for different races access to child support grants and old age pensions, and secondly to extend the child support grant, which was initially only up till 6, if I remember correctly, to extend it up to 18, and that was a result of quite considerable struggles by civil society that there was agreement around that. But the attempts to campaign for a universal social protection floor were essentially rejected by government.
Just to add to that, Neil, of course, it's not only that it excluded people who were not employed. That there was no provision for, say, adults between the ages eventually of 18 and 60, between the end of the child support grant and the start of a pension. But it also excludes from our design all the forms of work that are not considered work. So, it's basically women's unpaid labor is not seriously considered here at all. And it's not considered either in the design. So childcare is valued in a way. Just to say that when they de-racialized the grant, they also dropped the amount of the grant substantially. So the old state maintenance grant was much more generous than what we had under what we even now have under the child support grant. But what's excluded from that is care work, which is unrecognized, unpaid, and speaks to what I think is the socially conservative part of the white paper, which is the way in which it thinks about a lot of tasks that are important for us as a collective. It kind of uses the notion of community to basically further burden women. It says these are tasks, these are things that should be done within the family. But we know that the distribution of that work within the family falls disproportionately on women. And right at the time that the Taylor Commission, which is a really, really important process, which we are all returning to now, the time that it was working was also when the AIDS crisis was so significant. So the care burdens expanded so much, and the state was not coming into the game to do the kinds of things that would be needed to both capacitate the existing grants so that they were more useful, and to expand the grants by. So there's another part of this that has to be rethought, and that's our taxation system, right? In order to do this, we have to think about how we are going to find the funds to do it. And it's worth saying that in the 1990s and the 2000s, for all the economic problems we had, we were not the poorest of the poor countries. There was always the capability to fund it, but it required certain kinds of political will that just didn't, which Neil's also alluded to. There just wasn't the political will to do the things that were necessary. And we lost that moment when I think there was a kind of goodwill, if you like, kind of an apartheid dividend that you could draw on, right? That they didn't go down that road. The other element that I don't know, Neil, if you would agree, but I think we ought to bring into the picture is the ways in which dealing with apartheid was thought about post-1994, and that was Black economic empowerment as a kind of a measure, as opposed to a more radical redistributive approach. So, those bits of the story, they're not unrelated, because they all formed part of how the ANC government thought it was going to deal with the past. And I think frequently led us into situations where the needs of most people in society were not dealt with.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I mean, sorry, just to say that, the point that Shireen's just made is really important, because it was an elite transition model in which, she refers to the BE, and there's that famous paper by Thabo Mbeki in 1994 called Unmandated Reflections, in which he calls for an alliance between the ANC and big capital, and basically says that the ANC needs capital to invest, and therefore needs policies that are going to be attractive to capital, particularly foreign. And he saw foreign capital as being able to then finance the emergence of a black bourgeoisie in South Africa. So the focus was very much on elites rather than on the situation facing the majority of ordinary people. And if you look at the internal contestation within the alliance between COSATU and the ANC and the Communist Party and so on, between progressive and conservative factions within the ANC, a lot of these battles were around these very issues, around whether there should be a much more activist state, a redistributive strategy on social redistribution and creating a income floor, etc., but also a much more different approach to transforming the inherited economy. So this all has to be seen as connected. I think that's absolutely correct.
Okay.
I mean, also a lot, you'll remember, Neil, was presented as we have no alternative. This is what we have to do, right? But so in a way, we kind of get sold this bill of goods, right? We will create jobs through this other mechanism. Well, we need this kind of unrestrained investment, let's put it that way, very few guardrails for capital. Because if we do that, then we'll have all these jobs. And once we have all these jobs, then, that will be a better route to go, have more taxation, people. But actually, none of that materialized. And, there are always alternatives. I mean, it's really important to say what a society is prepared to do. There's more leeway than we think.
And, also, I think it's worth mentioning, Yvonne, that the elephant in the room then and the elephant in the room now is a very conservative center within the state, particularly in National Treasury, which has had a stranglehold over policies. So right then, from the social welfare paper to all those other engagements that we had with, 20 government departments and parliamentary committees, Treasury was the gatekeeper in virtually every one of them, and actually derailed and blocked progressive policy on a whole number of fronts. And I think it's a really good word of warning. I mean, a lot of people are saying, well, you got austerity and now you want a big. Isn't there a contradiction between the two? Of course there's a contradiction, because you can't have austerity, cutbacks, massive cutbacks in state spending, and have a big. These are two very different paths. And this reflects the ongoing contestation within the state, within the ruling party, etc. So this is a matter that really is going to, the contradictions within the state are intensifying in a period like COVID around an issue like the basic income grant. But the funny thing is, and having driven the introduction of a national minimum wage in South Africa, what you sometimes find is that there are moments in history where even if it doesn't appear logical, if it doesn't appear consistent with the rest of the policy framework, you can make a breakthrough in one area because society and the realities that people are confronting are mobilized around a particular need. And it's so obvious now in the period of COVID that we cannot have half our population starving and thrown into destitution. Many social forces are now coalescing around the idea of a big, which, is really, I think, what you're wanting to speak about. So not going to go on further on that issue.
Maybe we can speak about that now that you've already raised it.
Yeah.
We know that, with the Taylor report, the recommendations or the submissions, were not accepted because of the issue of affordability. And now in the time of COVID and also in the time of austerity, as you said, it's being put back on the table. Of course, we welcome that. But I think that process needs to be followed through very rigorously and consistently. So I'm interested to know, Neil, if you have been part of the prior conversation before that announcement by the social development minister. What has changed? So now we are putting big back on the table. What has changed? And if we are to implement it, in what ways should it be implemented such that it's proper and it's pro-working class?
Yeah, maybe if I can just come in and you're absolutely spot on. It's about rights. Just like a national minimum wage is about something that you can't take away. You can debate the level at which it's set, but once that right is put in place, you're never going to reverse it. The same with a basic income grant. It's an entitlement to all, not only all South Africans, but probably to all permanent and legal residents in the country and refugees as well. So it's not limited to South Africans, but it would be taking forward the constitutional rights, to progressively realize the security, the income security of all people in the country. That is very important. The question of the exact design and the moment in which it's implemented has a big impact on how you go about it. So what I mean by that is in the early 2000s, when we started the Basic Income Grant Coalition, a movement that I was very involved in, we were talking about a unified social security system in which the big would possibly replace certain other grants, and it would be, quite a significant improvement on the existing situation. The context in which we are introducing this now is very, very different, where we want to transition very quickly to a basic income grant because of this massive crisis that the majority of people are facing. We saw with the CRAM study, the loss of 3 million jobs, a further 1.5 million incomes, the massively disproportionate impact it has had on poor and working class women, that we don't have the luxury of time to build and to design a completely new social security system. So therefore, that is why the idea of targeting the 18 to 59-year-olds has now come about, because we have the child support grant, we have the old age pensions, and what the minister said is, let's target the 18 to 59-year-olds where this big gap exists. Some people have responded to say, but that's not a big. Actually, if it's a universal grant and everybody's entitled from cradle to grave to a grant, then you do have a big system in effect. Remember that the COVID special grant, the 350 Rand grant, is due to be ended at the end of October. So really, we need to move rapidly by November to replace that with a much more substantive and universal system. What we've seen with the COVID special grant is that anything that's means tested and has a lot of exclusionary criteria are used to discriminate against poor people. And again, as Shireen was saying, against women, because in the case of the COVID grant and the child support grant is only being given to carers, not to each child. And then on top of that, a mother who has two children is discriminated against because she doesn't get the increase in the child support grant, but she also can't get the COVID grant. So having a universal system in which everybody is entitled to it is very, very important, because it stops, number one, petty bureaucrats from preventing people from accessing their rights. It makes things administratively much simpler and cheaper to administer, and it's a right that is, is permanent. It's a floor which is created, which is there regardless of social and economic conditions, and people improve their lives over and above that income floor. And that's why it's very important to see this as not something that is aimed at particular individuals. It's aimed at households. It's aimed at bringing households and communities out of poverty, and therefore must be connected to all the other interventions, the public services that are provided, the health services, the national minimum wage that a breadwinner might be earning in a household, a grant for the unemployed, grants for the children, etc., etc. And then, I'll come back to this. You've got to then look at the overall economic effect of what that does to poor communities by raising the levels of income, demand, etc., etc. So it must be seen as an integrated part of your overall social and economic protection system.
I want to just ask you, Neil, whether you think, we have our own language in South Africa for this, and so politically it may be difficult to change, but a lot of people in other contexts are saying if we changed the language from a basic income grant to seeing it as part of the grant system, to seeing it as a universal income guarantee,
right,
or a basic income guarantee, that it would be a more accurate way and might actually change people's minds around the kind of stigma that go along in certain people's minds with the grant. So the interesting thought about
that's I think that's a very interesting point. And in fact, in the IEJ language, in the proposal we did to presidency on a package, we used the notion of a universal basic income. We didn't use the word guarantee, but I think that's even better. It's even stronger for the reasons that you've outlined. If it could be, if we could win the battle through changing the name, that would be easy. But
activism has its.
It's part of the battle, as well as I do that in the debates, Yvonne, around in the early 2000s when we were battling for the big, a lot of people in the ruling party and in government told us, well, what you're doing is creating dependency. So there's this deep notion, and even amongst the working class and poor people, there's this notion that, you're giving us grants, you're making us dependent, you don't want to give us jobs. So the whole crafting and packaging of what we're trying to achieve through a big, as Shireen is saying, needs to change, and we need to think through much more carefully the communication. This is about a grant, which is charity for the poor. It's about creating rights and about creating a different type of social and economic system. I think that is very important.
Just to also not let something that Neil said disappear, because and I think it's really important that we also think about this in relation to other parts of the system. At the moment, if you take the child support grant or even the pension, they go very, very far in terms of reducing poverty for a number of people. But if you look at the studies that have been done about how they are used, a lot of the grant is used in ways that they should not be if other parts of our system worked. So for example, a lot of mothers or carers, a lot of carers use the income grant to spend on long taxi rides to get to clinics that are far away. That's not an effective use of this, of the grant. It's not what it was intended to do. It has always been intended to work in the context of a functioning public health system and in the context of a functioning education system. And, what our grants have ended up doing is making poor people subsidize the failures of the state to do all those other things it is supposed to do, right? So we give this money to poor people, and then, we haven't built a public transport system. So now we want them to pay for the fact that the health, for many years, health budgets were not spent. They weren't fully spent. They were returned to Treasury, right? So all those inefficiencies, all of those weaknesses, I think, Neil's right. We have to put the grants in the context of a larger conversation about what the state is supposed to do. We have to worry, I think, at this moment of austerity, and I'm sure that Neil and colleagues are onto this possibility, that there are sectors in our society which will glom onto the idea of a big as a way to reduce the investments in all these other grants, right? So it'll be presented to us as a more efficient way. Also because, as we know, the state has inefficiently delivered grants to poor people. We know that, right? The SASSA debacle and so on. So, so we have to be very careful that big is not a replacement for other kinds of expenditures. And we also, I think pragmatically at this point, I don't know what you're thinking, Neil. Obviously, it would be great to have the grant at a certain level that will make a significant difference. But one thing we learned with the child support grant is that if you can get a principle accepted, you can then fight to expand the amounts of the grant, right? So like to get the principle of a universal income accepted would be quite a big gain, I think, in this moment. And perhaps the way to sell it to some sectors is that it does act as a kind of economic stimulus as well. It gets cash circulating in the economy, right? People are going to then spend it once you give it. So it's actually not just a drain. It should be part of the stimulus package.
Yeah, Yvonne, maybe if I can add on to a couple of things that Shireen said. I was in a debate a couple of nights ago on Kaya Radio with someone from the Free Market Foundation, and it was very funny because he kept on quoting my own writing on big from the early 2000s to me, and strongly proposing a big. But towards the end, it then came out precisely what Shireen was saying, that they want to replace public services with, and this is the conservative version of the UBI internationally, or the big internationally, is that you give people a basic amount and then they've got to look after themselves. The state sort of withdraws and says, you deal with your own health, you deal with your own education, etc., other needs. That's a very dangerous thing. So we're in a situation now, that's got an upside and a downside. The downside is the obvious point I've raised. The upside is, all sectors of society want some form of a big for different reasons. The question of the amount, I think, again, I was participating in a webinar in which Murray Lebron spoke, and I want to show one of the slides that he gave, but he made a very important point, which was to say, if you want a big or a version of a big, which either is not optimally designed, so for example, if you replace the old age pension or the child support grant and people end off worse off than they were before, or it's a very small big like the COVID grant, so it ends up at 300 Rand, then it's a huge missed opportunity. And so while I agree with Shireen that we're not necessarily going to get the level that we desire, the question is, what would be the floor? And a lot of people are talking about the upper bound poverty line, which is around 1,200 Rand per person, to say that that must be the absolute minimum. And I just wanted to show this slide quickly, if I can, which is Murray's slide, which is not cooperating. Okay. So yeah, so these are actually some slides I did for discussion, but yeah, this is Murray's slide, and what he shows is that if you look at the middle column with a big of 1,590 Rand, he estimates what the impact will be on improving the income shares. So the P0 to 10 is the percentiles of the lowest income grouping in the country, and then that progressively goes up to the P90, which is the 90, those in the top 10% of income in the country. And what it shows is that with a big of 1,590, you have a significant increase in the income shares of the lowest income earners, actually up to the 60 to 70% grouping. But with a big of only 815, that final column, the impact is much less. And then if you look at the bottom of the slide, it says with a 1,590 Rand big, poverty falls about 13%. It would cost about 243 billion, he calculates. And with 850 Rand big, poverty falls only 5%. So what he's done here, he's assumed that title there, tax clawback, is basically that the rich, the wealthy, give back the big through the tax system. And maybe that's a point worth mentioning, Yvonne, is the design of the system is not that everybody gets the same grant in effect. Everybody will be entitled to get the same grant, but then they will pay it back through the tax system, so that people earning above a certain amount give it back, and then people who are very wealthy will give back multiples of a grant, thereby cross-subsidizing the poor in accessing the grant, which is a much more effective way of administering it, because the tax system can do that very, very simply. Just by the way, you can only do that above above the amount that people actually pay tax, which currently is about 80,000 Rand a month. People get PAYE deducted. So it may be that initially, to start off with, everybody earning below the 80,000 gets the big, and those above it would have it deducted. That these systems always have their anomalies, but you would try and progressively improve that system over time. That's the sort of idea.
Cool.
Had we done it, of course, after the Taylor Commission, the trajectory of poverty in this country would
absolutely
look really different. I was, even the modeling then, as you'll remember, Neil, showed how massively more, even a small big at the time, which is what the coalition was calling for, even a small big had such massive effects. Finding that number, and I think if we can't get it through now, we will historically lose a significant moment in which there is such an apparent need by the public, and there's so much of an apparent willingness by many in the middle class to consider this.
People can see society is imploding. It's just we don't have a choice. We don't have a choice.
We don't have a choice, and we can see the interconnectedness. People are at this moment not comfortable. They should never be. But at the moment, what COVID has done is sort of made it very apparent that we can't be comfortable with people going hungry, while some people have a lot, right? So it's like, in terms of a tipping point for a policy initiative, it seems to be a good one.
I think the other thing, Yvonne, is I don't know who your audience is, but I would imagine, given who the Forge is and the Tricontinental, etc., that you aim, at sort of communities, working class organizations, trade unions, etc., and in a way an appeal to all the progressive forces that we need to cohere around a position which is the most practical, the most feasible, which is going to achieve the right in the most powerful way. So debates, for example, that are going on now, of course, people are entitled to debate the architecture, etc., but need to think through very carefully what the implications would be. For example, of insisting that the child support grant or the old age pension must be replaced by a big. That would delay it for years. Or, for example, saying on the other extreme, I know that some unemployed organizations who initially were calling for a very large big of like 12,000 are now radically scaling down their expectations and are saying, well, let's have a upper bound poverty line, but only for the unemployed and marginalized workers. Now, as soon as you do that, as soon as you make it targeted towards a grouping, then you lose the universality of the big, and you lose your ability to establish it as a right. So I think it's very important that in debating these issues, we come up with a demand, if you like, or a platform which pulls everybody together into something which is going to achieve the objectives that we're all striving to achieve, and that over time, of course, mobilize for the significant improvement of the level, even of who it reaches. In the long term, there's no reason why you couldn't, for example, Shireen spoke about with the child support grant and the old age pensions, which are means tested, that there are all sorts of anomalies with them. It might be that over 10 years or whatever, that you move towards the child support grant and old age pension with a much better unified system. But that's a debate that we can have the luxury of having over the next few years. We don't have the luxury of having it now. We need to ensure that something happens in November to replace the COVID special grant. And if it's not replaced in November, at least it's extended with a specific time frame within which a big will be implemented.
Yeah, sure. Definitely. I mean, as we've seen, emergency response is no substitute for governance or long-term planning. And I think there's something we can do because, I mean, we've seen that in many ways, the government has struggled with coming up with adequate responses in COVID-19. And I know that there was that submission by the Budget Coalition that, made the submission that, the social grant relief package really is too little, and it reaches a few people. So even during this time, I mean, we see the importance of other organizations outside of government playing a very important role. And I think if that is a continuous and a rigorous process, I mean, we could contribute to change. And another thing, Shireen, another thing I wanted us to talk before, I know that we're almost in fact, we're out of time. There is one thing that I really wanted us to talk about, and it is the issue that you raised of unpaid care work. And you raise, that issue around the arguments you make around the need for a holistic approach to these things. And that, obviously, if the public institutions aren't working, that's an added burden on women who are primarily the care workers. And so in many ways, households and communities absorb the shock that comes from these other institutions and the lack of proper infrastructure. And you make that argument in support of the analysis you make of the social grant system that it's not enough. And I really wanted us to talk about that issue of unpaid work. And I think it's important because if we are going to have a holistic approach, we are going to need to talk about social relations and social inequality. And the issue of gender inequality is very important. So I was wondering, because that issue of unpaid work has quite significant economic value. So I was thinking that how do we then support this issue of unpaid care work, right? Which has very significant care work, all right? So I was reading the UN report before this. It shows that not only unpaid healthcare work, but care work in general, women spend about 4 to 5 hours a day on unpaid care work in general. We're not talking about health care work, unpaid care work in general, right? Whereas this is different to men who spend about an hour, 2 hours of unpaid care work. And this is a 2020 reality, right? So I'm interested to know how then we support this unpaid care work through adequate policy making or through adequate policies.
You're absolutely correct that unpaid care work is a tax on women
Yeah.
for the economy, right? All those social reproduction tasks that are not considered to be costs are just a distribution of costs to women in the main. Other people do care. So I should say two things. One is that I don't necessarily think all care has to be commodified, all care has to be paid. I do think in the long term we want to move to a kind of a society where not everything comes with a kind of price tag. So we need some conversation about how we share our burdens in society. I mean, there are forms of intimate care, I think, that we do want to have provided by people who are closest to us, and we don't want to necessarily put a price on that, right? So that's the one thing. But there are forms of paid care work that are undervalued. So if you think of nurses, doctors in the public health system, who all those health professionals, all healthcare workers who in COVID we are seeing very clearly are carrying quite a heavy burden. They're often
Yeah.
the lowest paid,
Yeah.
right, in the system. So there we do need more collective action to ensure that those people get paid a fair living wage, right? So that's another aspect of the care system. The parts that are part of the paid labor system need to be dealt with. And then in terms of the unpaid care, obviously something like a big, which is not tied to work, that's its value, right? It's not tied to having a job in the formal economy, will
Yes.
go some way to reducing the burdens that carers face within families. But again, it's not going to, we shouldn't assume that it will automatically have an egalitarian effect within families and households. Because, in fact, men could say, as they say about the child support grant, oh, well, the state is giving you that money. So what are you complaining about, right? So we need a politics about egalitarianism in the social sector. We need a feminist conversation. We need our allies in unions to come on board with those discussions. We need our allies in social movements to start to think about those issues as also being issues of politics, as also being responsibilities not just of women to change those, right? So policies can make a difference. Again, I just go back to where I started with some of the Scandinavian policy making. Actually, policy initiatives can do more than we sometimes give them credit for. So some designs, for example, they were talking about high employment contexts, but in those contexts where there's high employment, they shifted from maternity leave to parental leave. They made parts of that leave only available to fathers to take. So, and the aim was to get men to take responsibility for their children as well. And in some societies like Denmark, you have seen more equalizing of childcare. It's not that patriarchy has disappeared. It's still more likely in places like Sweden that women will take parental leave and men won't, even though it's available to men to take. But it can change the distribution of care. More Danish men now take care of their children than ever before in history. So policy prompts, as it were, sort of can shift behavior patterns. And I do think we need to think about those. You're right. Policy does matter. It can't, people don't change without collective struggle. And in a good democracy, policies should be part of what we imagine as our collective instruments We can go back earlier, back to Cuba in the 1960s, which tried to experiment with family policies, which were really fun and interesting. I remember thinking about that in the 80s, and we tried to look for these examples in other societies. In Cuba, they had policies like, if you were going to buy groceries, that they were like men had to wait until women were served, which kind of eased in a very practical way certain kinds of burdens. But I'd say a more radical set of conversations would look at distributions of care, de-linking care from femininity, starting to open up difficult conversations about what father's responsibilities. In the Lund Committee, they, for example, looked at maintenance, and they were very concerned that men would think that if there was a child support grant, they would start a default on their maintenance grants for their children. So these conversations have been ongoing, and it's not like South African feminists have not been part of the conversation. We do need allies. We do need a broader social conversation. We do need to think about violence and care, another linkage that feminists are pointing to. Violence inflicted on carers, beating up women if they don't care for you the way you think they should care for you, for example. I think there is that conversation. I mean, I do think South Africa is, we have very, very large discussions about this. We don't always have allies in other sectors of, I can't, Neil, I'm sorry, but organized labor has not always been an ally around these kinds of questions. It's often tended to think more narrowly about, what the questions of the working class are. COSATU had a women's forum. I'm not sure it even has that women's forum or gender desk anymore to begin to talk about these matters. But in the 80s and the 90s, there was a very serious attempt to push that. And instead, as you know, some very senior union leaders have been responsible themselves for highly patriarchal, violent actions, and they don't get held accountable. So that big conversation has to happen. But big is only going to do some things that can't address everything. We can't say, well, if we have a big, we mustn't load those expectations. We still have to have that other politics. Women having an income will give them some security and possibly give them some choices. Maybe they can leave a violent relationship. But if we don't have the shelters there to make it possible for them to leave, then it's not going to work. So we mustn't oversell big either. We mustn't assume it can do all of these things because then we'll be disappointed. We have to keep alive all those other politics. We have to keep alive the movement for more shelters. We have to keep alive the demands that we make on police to adequately deal with rape, which they have not, as you know. We still don't have rape test kits in every police station, and so on.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. That's very rich and that's very important stuff, Prof. Neil?
Yeah, I mean, just to conclude on the points that Shireen's raising about the gender impact, particularly of the big, but I think in relation to the question of the support for working class women, for poor women, for women more generally, I think what's very clear in this COVID period is that women are bearing the brunt. I mean, if you look at the figures that came out of the CRAM survey, they were very disturbing about the extent to which women have lost jobs, the extent to which women have lost income, the extent to which women have been discriminated against in terms of what we spoke about in relation to the new social grants and so on. So this is critical. It's very interesting. I think what Shireen was saying was interesting. I think big should be packaged more as a feminist issue. You know, I think the fact it should be seen as in part a recognition, you know, of the right of everybody to have income, regardless of whether their work is compensated or not. And you know, obviously one needs to frame that and engage with how one interprets that, et cetera, et cetera. But the reality is that it will give people more independence. In countries like Brazil, I mean, what's been shown is that the grant system really empowered women to do things that they weren't able to do before. But as Shireen says, it's part of a broader social revolution. I think the other thing to say is that we also need to see it as linked to the broader economic debate. You know, I think it was Shireen or yourself raised the point about stimulus. It'll create a huge stimulus in local economies. You know, if we're going to spend 200 billion extra a year, or whatever it is, on a basic income grant, that's a massive injection into local economies where, again, it's your women, informal workers, you know, who are providing goods in those areas, but just general local economies. Could be massively, you know, stimulated together with other policies. The big, as Shireen said, can't do everything. And there again, it relates to the question of sustainability, because by creating that stimulus and linking it to other appropriate macroeconomic, industrial, and other, you know, job promoting policies, you then broaden the tax base. You make it more possible, like the social democracies that Shireen spoke about, to actually channel the taxes which are generated through that extra economic activity. So it's a virtuous cycle. And what we're in at the moment is the opposite of the virtuous cycle. It's a destructive downward spiral, and we've got to break that spiral. And what, as Shireen said, the big's not going to do it all, but this could be a major step forward in beginning to address the crisis which we're confronting.
Thank you so much. I think that brings us to the end of our discussion today. Sorry it went a bit long. I really wish we could go on, but because of time and commitments that we might have. Thank you so much. And please continue with your important work. You really are doing amazing work. And in my language, we say, Magwande, Magukanye. So let's continue in our Pambili. And have a good day, Shireen, and to us, Neil.
Nice to see you, Shireen.
Nice to see you. Thank you both.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thanks, Yvonne.